Raised his glass and smiled at me like I was nothing. Like I had always been nothing. I was sitting at table 11, not at the head table, not near my son, not anywhere that mattered. And Walter Greer, the man whose company logo was on every other billboard between Knoxville and Nashville, was standing at the microphone telling 250 guests what kind of woman I was. A woman who had struggled. A woman who had done her best, bless her heart, the kind of southern compliment that isn't one. My hands were folded in my lap. My champagne was untouched. And inside my purse, beneath my lipstick and my reading glasses, was a manila envelope that I had been carrying for 11 years. I had waited a long time for this moment. I could wait 11 more minutes. Let me take you back to where this really started, because it didn't start at my son's rehearsal dinner, or at the moment I found out who his future father-in-law actually was. It started on a Tuesday morning in March, 23 years ago, when I was 41 years old and my husband Gerald didn't come home from work. Gerald worked construction management for a mid-sized firm called Hargrove Building Solutions. He'd been with them for 14 years. He knew every subcontractor, every site foreman, every safety protocol in the state of Tennessee. He was careful. He was methodical. He was the kind of man who checked the weather before he drove anywhere and always told me what time to expect him for dinner. That Tuesday, dinner was meatloaf. I had it ready at 6:15. By 8 o'clock, I was calling his cell phone. By 9, I was calling his office. By 10, 2 police officers were at my front door and the meatloaf had gone cold on the counter, and my son Elliot was 7 years old and asleep upstairs, and my whole life cracked open like something that had been hollow underneath all along. Gerald had died in a partial roof collapse at a commercial site in Murfreesboro. The investigation called it an accident. A structural support had failed. The official report listed the cause as unforeseen material deficiency. The company paid out a settlement, not generous, but enough to keep me from losing the house that first year. I signed the paperwork in a grief so thick I could barely read the words. I signed because the attorney they sent told me it was fair. I signed because I didn't know any better, and because I had a 7-year-old upstairs who was going to wake up the next morning and ask where his daddy was. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for another 12 years, was that the structural report had been altered, that the support beam that failed had been flagged 3 weeks earlier by a site inspector, whose notes never made it into the official file, that someone with authority over that project had seen the warning and made a calculation. Fixing it would cost money and delay the timeline. And the timeline, apparently, was worth more than my husband's life. I didn't know any of that in the beginning. I just knew I was alone. I went back to work the following month. I had been part-time at a dental office before Gerald died. Scheduling, billing, front desk. After the funeral, I called Dr. Paulson and asked if he could give me more hours. He gave me full-time within the week. He was a decent man. I will always be grateful for that. I learned to do everything myself. I learned to change the furnace filter and unclog the gutters and talk to insurance adjusters without crying. I learned to pack a school lunch that Elliot would actually eat and to help with math homework I barely remembered. I learned to be 2 people, the steady one in the daytime and the frightened one at 2 in the morning when the house made sounds and there was no one next to me. Elliot grew up watching me do all of it. I think that's why he turned out the way he did. Steady, thoughtful, the kind of young man who called me every Sunday, even in college. He studied civil engineering, which used to make my chest tight in ways I couldn't explain. He graduated from UT with honors. He got a good job with a firm in Nashville. He called me on a Sunday in October 3 years ago and told me he had met someone. Her name was Laurel. She was smart and funny and had her mother's laugh, he said. I flew to Nashville to meet her at Thanksgiving that year, and I liked her immediately. She was warm without being performative about it. She looks at my son the way Gerald used to look at me, like she had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Her parents were invited to that same Thanksgiving. I was told they were traveling. Business, Laurel said with a small apologetic shrug. We'd meet at Christmas instead. Christmas fell through too. And then it was spring, and Elliot told me they were engaged, and the parents' meeting kept getting scheduled and rescheduled and rescheduled, until it became almost a joke among the 4 of us. I assumed they were busy people. I had no reason to think otherwise. I met Walter Greer for the first time at the engagement party Laurel's family hosted at their home in Brentwood. The house was the kind of house I had seen in magazines, but never inside. High ceilings, stone floors, the kind of kitchen where the refrigerator is hidden behind cabinet panels. Laurel's mother, Patricia, met me at the door with a genuine smile and a hug that felt like she meant it. I liked her right away. She gave me a glass of white wine and introduced me to their neighbors and asked about my drive down. Then Walter came in from the back patio. He was taller than I'd imagined, well dressed in the way of men who have been wealthy long enough to make it look effortless, silver at the temples, a handshake that was practiced, firm, brief, already moving to the next person before it was fully over. He shook my hand, said something polite about being glad to finally meet me, and turned to talk to someone else. There was nothing wrong with any of it. He was perfectly civil, but something shifted in me when I saw his face, something physical, like a key turning in a lock I didn't know I had. I spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out why. It wasn't until I was driving home on I-40, somewhere around Cookville, that it came to me. I had seen his face before, not recently, years ago, in a photograph. Gerald had kept files. He was organized like that accordion folders in the filing cabinet in our home office, labeled in his careful block handwriting. After he died, I kept them because I couldn't bring myself to throw anything of his away. They sat in the back of the closet in what should become my office, behind the winter coats, untouched for over a decade. When I got home from the engagement party that night at 11:30, I went straight to that closet. I had to move 3 boxes to get to them. My hands were shaking a little, which annoyed me. I sat on the floor of the closet and started going through folders until I found one labeled Hargrove. Site documentation. Gerald had been thorough. There were copies of contracts, inspection schedules, correspondence. And near the back, tucked in a plastic sleeve, was a photograph, a printout of a company directory page from Hargrove Building Solutions, dated 18 months before Gerald died. The man in the photograph was younger. His hair was darker, but the jaw was the same. The eyes were the same. The name underneath read, Walter Greer, Senior Project Director. I sat on my closet floor until almost 2 in the morning. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've had people tell me I should have gone straight to a lawyer or the police, and looking back, they're probably right. But when you spent 12 years telling yourself that an accident was just an accident, when you've made peace with something because the alternative was too heavy to carry, finding out that the peace was built on a lie doesn't make you feel brave. It makes you feel like the floor has dropped out from under you all over again. I also knew I had very little. A photograph and a name. A folder of documents whose significance I didn't fully understand. And a memory of a settlement I had signed away without reading carefully enough. So I did something quiet. I started researching. I want to say I did it in a calm, methodical way. I didn't. I did it in evenings after work, at the kitchen table with reading glasses I'd only recently admitted I needed, with too much coffee and a browser history I kept clearing out of some instinct I couldn't explain. I searched Walter Greer's name and found what was publicly findable. The company he now ran. A private development firm called Greer Capital Partners. His philanthropic activities. His family. His LinkedIn, which listed his past positions, including a senior role at a firm I had never heard of that had, I eventually pieced together, absorbed what remained of Hargrove Building Solutions after the company was quietly restructured in 2006. I found, buried in a local news archive from 2003, a short article about an OSHA investigation into the Murfreesboro site collapse. It described the incident as under review. There was no follow-up article. The investigation appeared to have closed without action. I didn't know how to interpret most of what I was finding. I knew I needed help. A woman in my church, Dottie, had a nephew who was a journalist. He wrote for an investigative outlet based in Memphis, one of those lean, scrappy operations that exists to do the stories larger papers won't. I called Dottie on a Saturday morning and asked for his number. I told her it was personal. She gave it to me without asking more. His name was Patrick. He was younger than I expected, early 30s, with the kind of careful manner of someone who had learned to listen before he spoke. We met for coffee in Knoxville. I brought Gerald's folder and spread it across the table like evidence in my own kitchen trial. Patrick spent 4 months on it. I didn't push him. We spoke every few weeks, and each time he told me what he'd found and what he still needed. He located the original site inspector, a man named Roy, who was now retired in Chattanooga, who had written the flagged report that never made it into the official record. Roy had kept a copy. He'd kept it for 22 years because he never quite believed the case was closed correctly, and because he'd watched too many friends retire early with ruined knees and lungs, and he had learned never to trust that the paperwork told the whole story. Patrick also found 2 former Hargrove employees who had been present at an internal meeting in the weeks before the collapse. They didn't want to be named, but they confirmed, separately, that concerns about the site had been raised and dismissed by a senior project director who had told the room that they were behind schedule and couldn't afford delays. Patrick wrote the article. He filed it with his editor in January. It was scheduled to publish in March to 23 years, nearly to the week after Gerald died. In February, Elliot told me the wedding date was set for the last Saturday in April. I thought about telling him. I spent most of February thinking about it, honestly. Lying awake, replaying conversations I hadn't had yet, testing out versions of the words, imagining his face. In the end, I didn't, and I want to explain why, because I know how it looks. Elliot was 3 months from marrying a woman he loved. Laurel was not her father. She had built nothing on what Walter had done. She didn't even know what he had done. Blowing the engagement apart with an accusation, no matter how well-founded, felt like burning down the wrong house. I also knew the article was coming. I knew Patrick's work was solid. I knew that what Walter Greer deserved was not a private confrontation where he could manage the narrative. It was a public one, documented and on the record that he couldn't walk back. I kept my silence. I kept Gerald's folder in my filing cabinet, and a copy of Patrick's draft in my email. I drove to Nashville 6 weeks before the wedding and helped Laurel's mother fold 250 linen napkins into shapes that neither of us could fully remember the name of. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was exactly where I needed to be. The day before the article published, I called Patrick and told him I would be at the reception the following weekend. He understood what I was telling him without me having to say it plainly. He said he would make sure his phone was on. The wedding itself was beautiful. A venue outside Franklin, white tents on a hillside, the kind of spring afternoon that Tennessee produces exactly 4 or 5 times a year, and that makes you understand why people stay. Laurel was radiant. My son cried when he saw her at the end of the aisle, which made me cry. And I didn't care who saw it. I sat in the 3rd row, not the front. The front row on the bride's side was reserved for Laurel's parents, and I understood that. I was not going to spend my son's wedding manufacturing grievances about seating charts. I sat in the 3rd row and I watched my boy get married, and I thought about Gerald, who should have been there, who had loved Elliot so much in the 7 years he'd had with him that even 23 years later the shape of it was still clearly visible in the man my son had become. The reception was held in the main tent. The dinner was served. The toasts were made. Elliot and Laurel danced their first dance to a song I didn't know, but that clearly meant something to them, and I watched from my table, 7 this time. Not quite as far from the center as I'd feared, and I ate the chicken and talked to Elliot's college roommate on my left, and a cousin of Laurel's on my right, and felt, mostly, okay. Then came the open toasting portion of the evening. Walter Greer stood up. He had the natural ease of a man who has spoken in rooms like this his entire adult life. He made a joke about Laurel's teenage years that got a laugh. He said warm things about Elliot, surprisingly specific things, details Laurel must have shared with him, and I found myself almost relaxing. Then he raised his glass and looked out at the tent and said, in the particular tone of a man who believes his own generosity in advance, and to Elliot's mother, who raised this young man on her own, we're so glad you could make it. It's a long drive from Knoxville, and we know it isn't always easy for people in your situation. The tent laughed, not cruelly. They didn't know what was underneath it. It was the polite laugh of people responding to warmth that sounds like warmth. I sat very still. People in your situation. I had been eulogized. Patted on the head in front of 250 people by the man responsible for the situation he was referencing. I waited until the applause settled. Then I stood up. I am 63 years old. I have spent the last 23 years making myself easy for people to overlook. I dressed practically. I drove a sensible car. I worked in a dental office and raised my son and deposited my modest savings and went to church on Sundays and never once put my name at the top of anything. But I had prepared for this. Thank you, Walter, I said. My voice was steady. I surprised myself with that. You're right that I raised Elliot alone. I've been doing that since March 18th, 2002, when my husband Gerald died on a construction site in Murfreesboro that you were responsible for overseeing. The tent went silent. Not gradual, immediate. I picked up my purse and removed the envelope. I held it but didn't open it. I didn't need to open it. The weight of it was enough. In the weeks before the collapse, I said, a site inspector filed a structural safety report flagging a deficiency in the roof support system on the third floor. That report was reviewed by the senior project director. The decision was made not to address it. Gerald's crew was sent in anyway. My husband was standing in the wrong place when the roof gave. I looked at Walter directly. His face had gone the color of old ash. His wife beside him had her hand over her mouth. I'm not here to destroy this wedding, I said. Laurel and Elliot have nothing to do with what happened, and this is their night, and I mean that. But I also spent 23 years being told it was an accident. I spent 23 years watching you build a career and a home and a reputation, and I think 250 people who care about this family deserve to know who they're raising a glass with. I set the envelope on the table. There's a full investigative piece publishing tomorrow morning. The reporter has the inspector's original report, testimony from 2 former Hargrove employees, and documentation of the internal meeting where the decision was made. Gerald's name is in every paragraph of it. I smoothed the front of my dress. I sat back down. The tent was still silent. Somewhere near the back, someone's chair scraped the floor. Then Elliot stood up from the head table and he looked at me, and there was so much in his face. Shock and grief, and something I could only interpret as recognition. Like a thing he had almost known for a long time was finally saying itself out loud. And he crossed the tent, and he came to table 7, and he sat down next to me without a word and took my hand. That was enough. That was more than enough. Walter Greer left the reception within 20 minutes. I watched him go, and I felt not triumphant. That's not quite the right word. I felt the specific relief of a weight I had been so long accustomed to that I'd stopped noticing it until it was gone. Patrick's article published at 7 o'clock the following morning. By noon, it had been shared widely enough to reach people I had never heard of. By the following week, 3 of the former Hargrove employees Patrick had originally been unable to reach had contacted him on their own. A Tennessee state legislator who had lost a relative to a construction site incident in the early 2000s issued a statement calling for a formal review. Walter Greer's firm announced in careful corporate language that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations pending an internal review. Roy, the inspector, called me on the phone that Tuesday. He was 74, and his voice cracked a little when he said he was glad someone had finally found the paperwork. He told me he'd held on to it because he knew Gerald had a family. He told me he was sorry it had taken this long. I thanked him, and I cried a little, and he was kind about it. Elliot called me the morning after the reception. He and Laurel had talked through the night, he said. He told me he wasn't angry. He said, and this is what I keep coming back to, that he wished I had told him sooner. And he was right. I held that for a long time before I said anything back. Then I told him I was sorry. I told him I'd been trying to protect the wedding and his relationship, and Laurel's sense of her own father, and that I had misjudged where the protection was actually needed. He said, Mom, I needed to know who Dad was. We were on the phone for 2 hours after that. Laurel called me herself 3 days later. She was quieter than usual. She said she was processing. She said she hoped I understood, that she was going to need time to figure out what she believed about her father and what she was going to do with it. I told her I understood completely. I told her I didn't need her to feel any particular way right now, just to know the truth was available to her whenever she was ready for it. I don't know yet where things will land with Walter. The legal questions are complicated. Gerald's settlement, the statute of limitations, what can and cannot be revisited after 23 years. I have a lawyer now, a real one, who tells me there may be avenues I haven't explored. I'm not holding my breath. I learned a long time ago not to stake my peace on outcomes I can't control. What I know is this: Gerald's name is in the public record now, attached to what actually happened. The people who loved him can say, "We knew this man, and this was done to him, and it was wrong." That's not justice exactly, but it's something Gerald deserved for 23 years, and it's something I was finally able to give him. I drove home from Nashville on a Sunday evening in late April, with the windows down because Tennessee in spring is worth breathing in. And I thought about the meatloaf that went cold on the counter, and the small boy upstairs who didn't know yet, and all the mornings between that one and this one. Gerald would have liked Laurel. I know that without any doubt. He would have stood up at that reception and given a toast that made the whole room laugh and then get a little misty. And he would have danced with me afterward. Badly, the way he always did. Because he never cared how it looked. I think he would have been proud of how it looked this time. I used to think silence was the same thing as strength. For 23 years, I told myself I was being strong, keeping my head down, doing the work, not making things harder for Elliot than they already were. But there's a difference between strength and waiting, and I didn't always know which one I was practicing. What I understand now is that Walter Greer was able to go on building his reputation and his company and his life because the people who knew the truth, Roy, the two former employees, eventually me, all made the same private calculation. We told ourselves the moment wasn't right. We told ourselves the costs were too high, the proof not quite enough, the disruption not worth it. And every year we made that calculation. The weight of it got heavier while he got lighter. That's how it works, I think. Not in the dramatic way people imagine, not lightning from the sky or a sudden reckoning. It works slowly, quietly, the way a structural deficiency works. The flaw is there from the beginning. It just takes time for the weight to find it. I think about Roy, 74 years old, holding on to a photocopy for 2 decades, because some part of him understood that the truth belongs to someone even when no one is collecting it yet. That's what I'd call integrity in its plainest form. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that just refuses to let go. He didn't know if anyone would ever call. He kept the document anyway. That one quiet decision changed what was possible for me. For Elliot, for Gerald's name in the public record. And Patrick, younger than my son, sitting across from me at a coffee shop, listening to a woman he'd never met, spread old folders across a table like she was presenting her case to a jury. He could have been polite and done nothing. Instead, he spent 4 months on a story that wasn't easy or safe or particularly glamorous. That's a kind of moral seriousness that doesn't get talked about enough. The willingness to do the hard, careful thing, not because someone is watching, but because the work itself demands it. As for me, I didn't do anything remarkable in that tent. I stood up and said true things that I had taken the time to understand and document. What I had, more than courage in the dramatic sense, was patience. I had learned over 23 years to tell the difference between what I could control and what I couldn't, and to put my energy only into the former. The article, the documentation, the relationship with Patrick, those I could shape. Walter's reaction, the legal outcome, how Laurel would feel about her father, those I had to release. Elliot said he wished I had told him sooner. He was right, and I have sat with that. Protecting someone from a truth they deserve is still a kind of withholding, and love doesn't make it less so. If I could do it again, I would have trusted him earlier. I would have trusted that he was strong enough to hold the weight of it, because he is. He always was. I just forgot for a little while that I hadn't raised a child. I had raised a man. Gerald deserved to have his name said correctly. That's what this was at the end. Not revenge. Not even justice, exactly. Just correctness. A wrong thing named plainly in front of people who could hear it. I keep thinking about Elliot crossing that tent and sitting down next to me without a word. 23 years of breakfasts and homework and Sunday phone calls, all of it landing in that one quiet movement. That was enough. That would always have been enough.